And if we intervene in Western Ukraine, the Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
Why?
Oh, I think the readiness has been on the decline for a long time. You've had an almost steady, uninterrupted decline in the discipline that makes soldiers fight. Discipline is a tough thing. We don't always understand it. Discipline is really a form of habit. And you build those habits over time through repetition, but you also build it under stress, under pressure, so that it sinks in. And then you build cohesion within the framework of those units. You don't build cohesion when you're dividing the force on racial grounds, when you're pushing people who are clearly unqualified up the ranks to command, when you're rewarding people for anything other than demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. All of those things are demoralizing, destructive to military establishments. The Army and the Marines are suffering with it. So is the Air Force and the Navy. And there's no easy fix. And these cracks that are just cracks at the moment will become giant fissures if you go to war.
So you spent the bulk of your adult life as an Army officer, went to West Point, commanded troops in battle. You're a combat veteran, decorated. But you entered the Army right at the tail end of Vietnam.
That's right.
When it was famously at its nadir.
Yes.
How would you compare the readiness of the current U.S. Armed Forces to, say, 1975 at the end of Vietnam?
I think that in terms of morale and discipline, we are close to where we were in the late 70s. We have a lot of people that are confused about what needs to be done. We've lost a sense of what's right. In other words, you don't have people that have served long enough in formations to know what right looks like, so that you can see a battle group, whether it's a battalion size or brigade or larger, and you know what makes things work. You know what it takes to fight in battle. We don't have very many people like that because since 2001, most of the fighting has been on a very small scale against a fleeting enemy. Running around in sandals with an AK-47, relying heavily on explosives, mines, to kill and maim Americans. About 87% of our losses were really a result of explosives that came from mines. This is not an army that is accustomed to fighting anybody who can fight back. If I were going to compare it to an army, a better comparison would probably be the French army before the Franco-Prussian War, because the French had fought Mexican bandits, Mexican rebels. They'd fought Arab bandits, Arab insurgents. They'd had a little experience fighting disgruntled, demoralized European troops, Austrians in northern Italy, but they hadn't faced a truly modern enemy. But people were convinced that the French army was the greatest army in the world because they'd fought in North Africa, in Indochina, Mexico, all over the world. That war was a catastrophe for France, and that army was decimated in months by a Prussian army that was a modern force, highly disciplined, very competently led, trained, and equipped. So we're not there. We have equipment that is decades old. The tanks that I served on, for instance, when I went to war in 1990, were virtually brand new, state-of-the-art. Those tanks are still out there. They've been rebuilt, but they're not new anymore. They're no longer as capable as they once were. I'll give you a quick example. We have a turbine engine in the M1, A1 series tanks, and that turbine engine burns up as much fuel sitting still as it does moving, because it's a turbine engine. It was designed to be used on an aircraft. We put them into tanks. So that means you've got an 8-hour tank. Every 8 hours, if you're operating, you've got to refuel this thing. This thing also burns fuel at a very, very high temperature, over 1,000 degrees. And there are 40 plus connections around the engine that are very brittle, that can easily cause fires if accidentally they touch these little tubes that carry various types of fluid, if they actually touch this engine that's burning so hot. So the engine is so hot that you can track the movement of U.S. Army ground forces with tanks from low Earth orbiting satellites. So if you think you're going to hide or conceal yourself or outpace somebody, you're just a glowing target from space. To this must be added the ridiculousness of not having replaced that engine with a reliable, state-of-the-art diesel-electric engine, which is much cooler, which can go for 24 hours or more without a refuel. And these things are extremely problematic when you go to war because you have to pull forces back, refill them, return them to the front. That's not easy to do when you're operating as frequently as every 8 or 6 or 9 hours. They say, well, we put a generator on there to make up for this when you're sitting still. The problem is that you don't sit still for very long in combat, because if you do, you're going to be targeted and destroyed. And that, of course, is what we're seeing in Ukraine. Persistent surveillance from space, from overhead surveillance, makes everything visible all the time. So if you're going to embed yourself in the ground, if you're going to set up a permanent position there where you try to fire from that, you're going to be targeted and destroyed very, very quickly. So that's why this defense right now looks a lot like World War I, because anybody who moves is identified and killed. The only limitation on your ability to target and destroy the enemy is ammunition. The Russians, of course, have no shortages whatsoever. You recall at the beginning of this, we have all these shortages, right? The Russians can't keep up with missiles. The Russians can't keep up with shells. Well, they have multiple manufacturing facilities operating 7 days a week at 24 hours a day. We have no surge capacity in the United States. It would take us many, many months to come up to that kind of standard where we could actually compete in high-end conventional warfare. And that's why people like me and others worry that if we get into a confrontation, that we cannot win, because the world has changed, warfare has changed, integrated air defenses will knock virtually everything that flies out of the sky, that we will then fall back on a nuclear deterrent, a tactical nuclear weapon that says, if you keep advancing, we'll have to use a nuclear weapon. We don't want to go there, because the notion that there are so-called tactical nukes, you've heard that expression?
Yes.
Oh, that's just a little nuke, so that won't precipitate a major war. The use of any nuclear weapon is going to precipitate escalation very rapidly, because your opponents will assume that if they don't use their nuclear weapons, they're going to lose them. So we're living in a terrible dilemma right now. The smartest thing that we can do is end this war.
What is Russia's objective, do you believe? Assuming the objectives change over the course of a war.
Of course. Right? Well, the original objective, obviously, was very different. I mean, if they'd made peace with the Russians back in, let's say, March or April, I think the Russians would have retained very little territory, probably only Luhansk and Donetsk, the two so-called breakaway provinces. And I think there would have been guarantees of neutrality for Ukraine and guarantees of equal rights before the law for Russians. And that's what people don't understand. Most of this has to do with abuse meted out to Russians in Ukraine by the Ukrainian government. And this, of course, is this radical nationalist government that came to power in Kiev in 2014. And they almost immediately, as soon as that government came into power, they started launching a war against the so-called breakaway provinces. And Putin kept trying and trying and trying. The Minsk Accords were another good example, trying to get to a solution that would not involve confrontation. Now we know, of course, thanks to Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, that the Minsk Accords were just a ruse, a way to kill time and give the Ukrainians more time to build up their forces. To build up their forces for what? And it's pretty clear they were building up for an offensive against Russia. And of course, the next step was that we bring in our missiles and station them in eastern Ukraine, which puts them in a couple of minutes away from all of Russia's cities and all of Russia's nuclear deterrent. So this was unacceptable. So that original deal is gone now. And the question is, what will the Russians accept? Well, I think they're going to demand that whatever remains of Ukraine, rump Ukraine is what most people are calling it now, most of what's probably west of the Dnieper River, has to be neutral. It can't be part of NATO. The Russians will never tolerate NATO forces on Ukrainian soil, because we've demonstrated conclusively that we are fundamentally hostile to Russia. So that's the minimal requirement. How that's governed, that's another question. Who knows? I'm sure Moscow would want to have some say in that government, and who is there to ensure that behind the scenes they are not once again subjected to the treatment that we subjected to them to in the Minsk Accords.
What is the Ukrainian objective?
I think more and more Ukrainians just want to survive this, and that's becoming very hard. And Zelensky and the radicals around him are basically committed to fighting this war to the last Ukrainian. And of course, I'm sure that Mr. Zelensky and his friends are anxious at some point to retire to their estates in Florida or Venice or Cyprus to collect on the billions that they've managed to steal or siphon from all the aid that we've provided. Remember, Ukraine is probably one of the most corrupt places in the world. A friend of mine who had spent time in the old Soviet Union and also lived in Mexico came back from a visit to Mexico, and he said, it's hard to believe this, but Ukraine is more corrupt than Mexico.
Wow.
And I think that's true. So this is a world-class disaster. 14 million Ukrainians have left the nation, presumably never to return, because when they're asked in Germany or France or Croatia or Spain or wherever they go, we will never go back. So what are you going to do with this country? And then, of course, we have the usual suspects, the great agricultural business conglomerates, along with BlackRock, who have their eyes on the fertile Ukraine ground in Western Ukraine. I suppose there'll be a big effort to get control of that in some fashion. That may not work, though, once this war ends with a complete and utter defeat of the Ukrainian regime.
Who is Zelensky? Exactly. How would you characterize Zelensky?
Vocês acham que todo trabalho merece remuneração? Ajuda a gente. O Pix está aqui embaixo. Dá seu like, faça sua inscrição. Principalmente divulgue para os amigos. Nós tínhamos 78 mil inscritos. Tá? E a gente tinha visualizações bem altas, até superiores a isso. Ajuda a gente a voltar a um patamar, pelo menos, mínimo de 1.000 inscritos. Porque ficar falando para poucas pessoas, não é que você não merece, claro que merece, mas é desgastante você usar tanto trabalho, tanto esforço, tanta luta, e quando você vai ver, a tua plateia está pequena ainda. Quer dizer, a tua voz de reverberação está pequena. A gente não traz aqui historinha para crescimento pessoal, não sou candidato a porcaria nenhuma, não é nada disso. Não. O que a gente traz aqui é simplesmente ideias para formar, ajudar a que você forme a sua opinião. Tá? E a gente se sente altamente debilitado com esse grupo pequeno que nós temos agora. Então depende de você ajudar. Dá ajudinha pra gente e se inscreve, chama os amigos. Vamos lá, tá ok? Um grande abraço.